I had a quick question. Is our final during exam week or on the last week?
It's during the exam period. Yeah. I think it's the 20th of April. If I recall from Bear Tracks.
There's one other class where it says I have a final in the exam,
right.
And then she was like, "No, we'll just do it at the last week of class."
Okay.
So I just wanted to double check since it's online.
Technically, you're not allowed to do that, but okay, unless it's an evening class. But people break the rules all the time, you know. At U of A, everything's legal just as long as you don't get caught. Okay. Microphone. Okay. Sorry, too much. Okay. All right. So, the good news is obviously that it's Friday. So you made it through the first week of the semester. The bad news is that means there's 12 weeks of the semester left. So we're still at the very beginning with 1 week of reading week, so technically 13 weeks. So that's the good and bad news. All right, happy Friday. Welcome back to Sociology of Youth, right? This is SOC 377. And I won't say that every time, but you know, sometimes people are still looking around for rooms in the first couple weeks. So if anyone is in the wrong place, I want them to know. Okay, so today we're going to keep talking about this history of kind of youth and childhood that we started on last time, right? So last time we're working through Neil Postman's sort of argument in his book, The Disappearance of Childhood, where he basically argues that, you know, childhood as we think of it, right, is mostly a social category, right? And it is I don't know why the camera is pointed out at the class like that. That's a little weird. It's a social category, right, a social construct, and one that largely emerges from a technological innovation, right, a technological kind of moment in the invention of the printing press and the growth of print as a dominant medium from, you know, the 15th century through into, and really our notion of childhood, as he kind of thinks of it, is more or less fully formed by about the 1950s. So in about 500-year period, right, we get a slow development of childhood, right? So last time we went back to like the Greeks and Romans, and sort of, especially with the Greeks, noted they don't really have a notion of childhood that's recognizable to us. The Romans, a little bit more, and then in that 1,000-year period between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the invention of the printing press, that notion of childhood, you know, disappears really, and children, for what they are, really are sort of miniature adults. They're part of the economic system, right? They don't have any sense that, you know, they're innocent or their lives, they need to go through this period of delay before they enter the economy. All of that kind of starts with the invention of the printing press for Postman. And I think, obviously, that's right, or I wouldn't talk about it every year. Okay, so I guess this is the last slide we looked at fully, right? And here, what Postman notes is that I'm tired of red pen. I want a green pen today. There we go. I don't know why. Green pen. Okay, so what Postman notes, right, is that printing creates a separation between children and adults, principally based around knowledge, right? Adults have way more, even just general knowledge, than children do because they acquire that knowledge through reading, right? And reading, unlike speech, is not a natural human function. It's something that, essentially most of the population can be taught to read, but they don't just pick it up. It has to be very intentionally taught, right? So, increasingly, what we need is a time and space for children to be taught. Okay, so, I don't know why. This nun always makes me laugh. Her face. My dad went to like a really Catholic boarding school. My dad is almost 80 now. But when he was a kid, he went to a Catholic boarding school. He still will tell the occasional stories about the nuns. And they had given the loving nickname to one of the nuns. She was called by the students Sister Paul the Murderer. I presume she was very nice. And I always think for some reason that this is what she must have looked like. I'm sure that's not true. Honestly, this is back in the 1950s. So a long, long time ago. Or 1960s maybe? I don't remember. All right, so we talked about the 3 conditions that postmen think are necessary for childhood, right? For our notion of childhood. So the first one, he says is shame, right? There needs to be, essentially shame is knowledge that we don't think children should have, right? Things that they shouldn't know about and that we feel bad about if we let them know, right? So we think it's bad, generally to expose children to sexually explicit materials, right? At least I hope we do, right? We don't think that 7-year-olds should be watching hardcore pornography. Like I said, at least I hope we don't. My friend, I was describing last time how I had a friend who let his 5-year-old play Grand Theft Auto 5, and how one of his friends was, genuinely horrified that her son might also be playing Grand Theft Auto 5, right, at 5 or 6 years old, right? And this is a concept of shame. There are things in that game that we think young people or children shouldn't know about. Okay, now, so hopefully shame kind of makes sense. Condition number 2 is literacy. And literacy is the system by which we dole out knowledge over time, right? So basically, the way that the print culture sort of developed was that adults end up in charge of the information environment. And it is up to them to choose at what pace young people are taught what things, right? And largely this is done through control of literacy, right? We basically have different topics that are covered and kind of released through books at different times. So, right, we have children's books. We have books for young adults. We have books for adults, and as we go through, the themes of those books and the kind of knowledge, even if we think of just literature, right, to say nothing of like books that are just nonfiction, as, people grow up, they learn how to read more, they get more mature, we kind of let them read books. Cal, who I didn't know who that was, but apparently she started out as a child influencer and she's now moved into OnlyFans. And so I had to Google this person, and now my Twitter is full of Piper Raquel, and I'm genuinely kind of horrified. I'm like, okay, something has gone wrong. Is there a way to clean the algorithm, to scrub something out of it? Because I really don't want to see this person anymore. Anyway, we have, Dora is going to explore, certain things like environments that polar bears live in, right? And we're going to deal that information out. And as you get older, right, maybe you get into young adult novels and there's some more romance and maybe some mildly sexual themes. And then, as you go forward, more and more of that gets revealed through literacy, right? And adults largely, for the most part, kind of control that information environment by either allowing or not allowing young people to interact with certain types of texts. Okay, so that's condition number 2. And the third one is school. And school is largely where literacy is taught, right? That is where we actually, so anywhere you have literacy, you ultimately end up with schools. And as more people get literate, or as the goal of a society becomes to make more people literate, the number of schools is going to increase, right? It becomes a system that grows and grows. It is also the place of delay, right? So that delayed transition into the adult world is largely that period where young people are in school, right? We expect that they are not going to be full participants in the economy while they're in school, right? Because school becomes their occupation. So they're innocent, right? And we delay their entry into the workforce or into the economy largely so they can be taught, the skills that they need, principally literacy. Numeracy gets added in there as well over time. Alrighty. Just wanted to see if I had any questions. I don't yet. Okay. Take a drink of my delicious tea. So, the period, so kind of starting, this is going to drive me nuts. For some reason, when I get too close to the top of the screen, it sometimes flashes me back into PowerPoint. Okay, so this period from 1440 onward, and we can kind of say probably until, let's say 1850, roughly to the middle part of the 19th century, maybe till 1950. Though I think 1850 is probably closer. Postman calls the incunabula of childhood. And incunabula basically just means cradle, right? Or the crib of childhood, right? Our notion of childhood doesn't emerge right away. It's not like, the printing press gets spread around. We have printing presses being, built and operated all over Europe, and suddenly, boom, modern notion of childhood. No, this notion is sort of developed over, like I said, like a 400 to 500 year period. So it actually takes quite a long time for this cultural revolution to really take hold. Okay, so as any kind of major social revolution does, the transition in Europe, right, from oral to print culture, it takes a long time, but it causes new social categories to emerge. And for our purposes, the first of these is the idea of children. So, children first, and then later we're going to get to things like adolescents or teenagers. But I will say, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this as we go forward, we don't really even have anyone talking about adolescence as a period of life until the 19th century, right? It's towards the middle to end of the 19th century that we get in English the word adolescent. And it's not until 1957 that the word teenager is used for the first time, right? It's used for the first time in an article in the New York Times, right? So, this process takes a really long time, and what happens is first we get children, and then over this 500-year period, we kind of, how should I put this? We segment this experience of childhood and youth more and more and more, right? Okay, so children start to become a separate class, right? Because they are that class that needs to be taught how to function in a print culture, right? And it's certainly not egalitarian, right? If you're from the elites, right? If you are in the nobility, if you are in the merchant class, your children have a much better chance of having a childhood than, say, if you're poor, right? In which case, they're still not going to have much of a chance. Now, education becomes an important social goal as well. Governments very quickly realize the importance of literacy and print. Even if some of them are kind of scared of it, right? You definitely want good scientists, you want, soldiers, and especially generals who are well educated, who know the history of war, and tactics and strategies and all of these things, so that they can better guide armies, right? Once you get into the industrial period, you definitely want workers, and you want, merchants and industrialists that are literate, so that your economy, surges ahead, so that you have, more wealth, better weapons, and all of that jazz. Okay, so I know this probably seems slow in some ways, but from like a historical standpoint, this is very, very fast. By 1560, right, so 120 years after Gutenberg first sort of comes up with the printing press, Presbyterians in Scotland, and we owe the Scots a lot, are already calling for a national system of education, right? So they want essentially a national system of more or less universal education here, specifically for the nobility and merchant classes, but they want a publicly funded education system that would teach people how to read and write, right? So this is a very quick adoption of a technology, and very quickly some people are queuing in on how important this technology is going to be to the future health and wealth of the nation. Okay. I always wonder if that does not look like that's working. I need to check something. Oh, I think I know what's going on. I'm just going to pause for 1 second. I wonder if my Slido is not running on my end. Oh no, the Slido box has disappeared from my PowerPoint. That explains what's going on. Just going to close PowerPoint for 1 second and then bring it back and see if that helps. Oh dear, Slido is gone. Something has happened. Okay, I will try to fix that later. I'm going to just join on my end on my phone and then keep an eye on it on my phone, because that's not awkward at all. So you can still ask questions, they just won't appear on the screen. Back to search. Sorry about this. I knew something was off. I don't know what it is. There's probably sometimes Slido wants to do an update and it breaks everything. Okay. Let's go. And I see questions here. Sadly, you can't see them, but I will read them out. Okay, yeah, all right. Back to the slide. Okay, 3 questions. Will we compare some non-Eurocentric examples of the history of youth? We're going to stick mostly to kind of Western examples. This will largely, in other places, sort of follow similar patterns, although what ends up happening is, say, in a country like Japan, right, where Japan in the 19th century, basically is sort of forced into modernization. This process goes a lot faster, right? The Japanese go from essentially, where Europeans were in 1440. It takes the Europeans 500 years to get there. It takes Japan maybe 50, right? Because Japan largely copies the Western model. Similar things you can see in China, right, after the Maoist revolution. You see similar kind of super accelerated processes, but they look fairly similar in most places, right? Because most places will look at the West and be like, okay, we want what the West has, and so we go through this process of literacy industrialization. They just do it in these super compressed timelines. But it's a good question. Okay, today more kids have early access to phones, tablets, which change how much literacy they have access to. What's the role of adults in protecting kids? Can I punt this question to the very end of the course? Because we will talk about this. So I guess let me give you a very quick preview. One of the things that seems to be the case is that as these technologies have opened up more and more information, and especially in forms that are so much easier for kids to consume, e.g. videos, we're really having trouble controlling the information environment of children. which is why Postman thinks childhood is disappearing when TV comes along. My God, he died in 2003. If he could have lived to see TikTok, I'm sure he probably wouldn't have wanted to. It's probably for the best that he died in 2003, right? Right, that's it. Okay, this publicly funded system was solely for, the Scottish Presbyterians never really established, so that's the kind of one of the big churches in Scotland. They never actually established public education. It takes a long time, right? You won't see fully funded public education really appearing until the 19th century, but already they're calling for it, but they don't really care about the poor that much. They're like, well, the merchants and nobility should know how to read and write. Okay, can somebody drop this class? I want a spot. Any volunteers? No? Okay. I will say, I usually, in that second week of classes, open up probably somewhere between 5 and 10 additional spots. But I want to make sure to weed out the people who aren't that interested in the class. So I wait until those people have sorted themselves out of the system. Yeah, probably sometime Monday, Tuesday, so keep an eye on it. What is the map on the screen, and why are literacy rates higher in Eastern rather than Western Europe? This is a very modern map of literacy. It's not historically true. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that the formerly communist countries did and continue to do really, really well is either get everyone literate or manipulate official statistics to make it seem that way. But I mean, it's like, we're talking pretty fine striations here. It's like 99% or more versus 98 to 99%, right? You're talking like 1-2% difference. But apparently, I don't know, the Spanish basically can't read at all, from what I can tell. No, less than 98%, right? A bunch of illiterate Spaniards running around. No, I have no idea. I'm kidding. Spain is lovely. If anyone wants to buy me a ticket to go to Spain, I wouldn't say no. Okay, now I have to remember that I have to keep an eye on this, and I can't clear comments from here, so just keep adding them. Okay. Ooh, I can go recent. There we go. That'll put them at the top. Okay, so, and I'll fix that for next time. Oh, updates in software break everything. Okay, so Postman makes the following kind of case, and this is kind of obvious. Where you have high literacy, there are schools, right? Now, where there's schools, a concept of childhood starts to develop, right? And what I'll say is as the number, and this is on my next slide, I'll talk about this, but I'll mention it now. As you have kids in school, people start to notice, kind of things about these small humans. And so you get finer and finer kind of distinctions made in what a child is, right? Okay, now again, what you see as print becomes dominant is a quick growth of schools, right? Okay, so in 1480, right, 40 years after the invention of the printing press, there were 34 schools total in England. Not the whole UK, right? Just England, right? So that part kind of south of Scotland to the English Channel, not including Wales, right? So a pretty small land area. 34 schools, though, not very many. By 1660, right, so we're talking 200-ish years after the invention of the printing press, 220, you have 444 schools, or one about every 12 miles, right? Which for a principally rural society is quite a lot. Okay, so what happens once you put kids in school? Well, Postman suggests that school changes the relationship of adults to children, right? So children go from being miniature adults, right? People that you put to work as soon as they are physically able to do basic tasks, right? To unformed adults, right? So now it's like children are a sort of means to an end, and that end is a fully formed adult, but they're not there yet. So instead of treating them like, okay, why aren't you, laying bricks or cobbling a cobbled thing? Shoes are cobbled things. Mill a milled thing, mostly grain. Smith a blacksmithied thing. I don't know. I'm going to stop. it's more like, okay, we need to get you that knowledge, we need to put you in school so you learn, reading skills, you learn some math, and you're then able to enter the adult world in a better position. Okay, so in that kind of medieval system, right, and I mentioned this last time as well, feudalism, childhood effectively ends at about 7 years old, right? You're an infant, then you're really young, you're too young to really do any work, but by 7 years old, you are becoming integrated into the economy, right? Because, other than your parents have to do that in order to survive largely. Okay, now that changes as we go forward. And again, it takes a really, really long time. By the time we get to the 1950s, basic elementary and high school education becomes the norm, right? So most people have primary and secondary school, but that takes a really, really long time. Like even as close in time as my maternal grandparents, this wasn't necessarily the case. Like I think my maternal grandfather, not that long ago historically, but it seems really, really far away. Okay, so what happens in school? As I've kind of mentioned, school is the period that children are shielded from the demands of the adult world in order to teach them literacy, right? Okay, a bunch of things kind of happen. So one, learning becomes sequential and hierarchical, right? Now this is a particular claim that Postman's making, and it largely comes from, bless you, from his kind of philosophical belief that technologies sort of impose their structure on the minds of the people who use them. So if you've ever thought like, wow, I think TikTok is making me dumb and have a short attention span, Postman would largely agree with that. He's like, yeah, TikTok as a medium is short form, so it makes you dumb and have a short attention span. I'm not saying that. Postman's saying that. I asked him with my Ouija board. No, I'm kidding. Never play with Ouija boards. If I learned one thing from watching all those exorcism movies, it's Ouija boards are dangerous. Okay, so, but I can blame Postman's ghost for telling you things. I always use a crystal ball, never a Ouija board. Okay, so what he basically claims is that because print, right, it's very sequential and hierarchical, learning becomes that way too, right? So you start by mastering basic skills like the alphabet, phonics, pronunciation, sentence structure, like grammar, sentence structure, punctuation, before moving on to more complex skills. And the whole kind of belief about how you raise human beings and form the human mind comes to follow that as well, right? Teach basic skills to complex ones. And you very much see that, in the way that we educate people today, right? You start in, I don't know, I think now it's like when they're 3 years old, you put them in like Montessori, and then you kind of move up from there. Okay, I got to look at questions. Do you have any opinion on how allowing children to choose their education, i.e. Montessori, and how that might impact the future success of youth? No, I actually, honestly, not my field. I'm a sociologist. I'm not a philosopher of education. So I actually don't have a great answer to that question. Okay, what was I saying? All right, so we build one skill before moving to another. And again, if we think of how education was done before this, it's a little bit different, right? I described last class the sort of Socratic method where how you learned, like say if you were Thomas Aquinas in the 14th century and you went off to study in Paris, he would have talked to a philosopher and been like, okay, here's my question. What's your answer? And that philosopher would answer it, and then you go back and forth in questions. It's not very sequential, right? It's not like we will learn the basics of philosophy, then move to the more complex. No, it's just like, all right, let's chat about philosophy, and that's how we develop our ideas. Socratic method. We get a much more sequential method when we get literacy and schools, right? Because it's sort of required to teach large numbers of people these basic skills. The other thing that happens, and this largely goes to what I was saying a second ago, when you cluster young people together, you start to notice certain things about them that you might not notice individually, right? And especially, say you're a teacher, what people notice is that, okay, if I take an average group of 6-year-olds, they have roughly the same level of ability, right? And the 12-year-olds are different, the 15-year-olds are different. They have different needs, aptitudes, what they can learn. And so what we start to do is we group them by age, right? So we're like, the average 6-year-old is able to do this, so we're going to put all of those people together and teach them all the same thing, right? And this is where we get systems of kind of grades, right? You're in first grade because you're 6, right? It has nothing to do with your ability. And sometimes, right, this is hard for those 6-year-olds who already know how to read when they come into first grade. Because like, yes, I'm stuck here. I'm reading Harry Potter. Well, my peers are reading like Run, Dora, Run, or whatever. Why am I being so mean to Dora today? Oh, no. Oh, okay. Anyway, right, so we start to notice things, qualities of children. Okay. Which is my first, okay. The other thing that happens, we notice, and that's the second quote, that's what I was just talking about. When any group is formed on the basis of a characteristic, it's inevitable that other characteristics will be noticed, right? So we start to develop more and more kind of ideas about what children are, and we start to study them as children, wherein we notice even more things about them, right? So, by separating people into classes or age striated education kind of clusters, wow, that is a sentence. Okay, sorry. I don't think I've ever said it like that. Rather than according to ability, right? We start to cluster young people together, right, according to age, and we have a lot of young people together and very few adults. One of the things that starts to happen is we start to get youth cultures emerging. The other thing is, as we try to educate people, we start producing more things specifically for children. Okay, so what starts to happen very quickly is, so by the end of the 1500s, right? So we're talking, a little bit like about a century and a half or a little bit more after the invention of the printing press, children's clothing becomes the norm, right? And we have different clothing for children than adults, and it looks different, right? We know this from like historical portraits. Children's clothing really starts to differentiate from the clothing of adults. And I mean, prior to this, right, up until you were about 4 or 5 years old, as a child, you essentially wore like a dressing gown, right? It was like just a white kind of unshaped piece of cloth, right? Probably had been worn by many of your older siblings. And then once you kind of became, 6, 7 years old, then you were put into clothing that very much looked like adult clothing because you were doing a lot of adult things. So by the end of the 16th century, right, the 1500s, we start to get the norm of children's clothing as being different, and you start to get notions of like play clothes, school clothes, and things like church clothes, right? People get more types of clothing. People start to differentiate children's language and categorize children's language, right? So you start to get things like nursery rhymes written down and kind of put to paper that are language specifically for children. You get books on pediatrics, right? The first books on pediatrics to be written essentially since the Roman period are written sometime prior to 1600. We don't know 100% when it was published. We know our texts on pediatrics, right, circulating prior to the end of the 16th century. And the first children's books, right, books targeted specifically for children, the first one we have a kind of record of is this one, The History of Jack the Giant Killer, which is published in London in 1744. So, I mean, because capitalism is capitalism, right? That means there's a market for children's books, and there's a large enough audience of parents who are willing to purchase it that it's profitable, right? Prior to this, kids are being taught to read by reading, school books, like manuals, and things like the Bible, largely. Okay. Ooh. Really wish that was working, but it will remind me to look. Oh dear, what did I do? I hit refresh. Hopefully I don't have to re-enter the code. Okay, yes, sorry. Does Postman say anything about the influence of the Industrial Revolution, like the shift from people living in rural areas to cities? Yes, that's coming, trust me. All right. So, we're now at the cradle of childhood, number 5. That's usually where most franchises start to get bad. I'm kidding, sorry. Star Trek V, notoriously a terrible Star Trek movie. So, modern nuclear families start to emerge, right? One of the things that happens, like along with this growth of literacy, Europe is getting into pre-industrialization, right? There's a kind of pre-industrial period that happens after, there's lots of stuff going on. I don't want to get too deep in the history. But basically the Europeans are, have sailed to the Americas, right? There's a colonial trade going on. Europe is getting a lot richer and is building towards industrialization in Europe, right? But already what you have in Europe is a really thriving merchant class, right? Even before the Industrial Revolution, a lot of them are merchants that make their money, getting goods like sugar, beaver pelts, and lumber and other things from the Americas and bringing them back to Europe, sometimes turning them into finished goods and selling them. But largely, right, there's already a really wealthy merchant class growing in Europe, right? And there's trade in things like tea and all of this stuff. So you already have a wealthy merchant class growing, and that class is largely pretty literate. Now, what you get with that, and this is the result of a couple of things, right? But largely a result of growing wealth, right? It's money. You start to get the emergence of nuclear families. Now, because what you're getting is an increasingly complex economy, even prior to industrialization, people are needing more and more education, right? The merchant class needs to be relatively well educated, right? Because they're keeping these complex ledgers of goods that they're trading, right? They're coordinating trade happening on 3 continents, right? Because they're getting goods being sailed from India, to some extent from China, because tea is already a big thing, by the time we hit the 18th century. And a lot of goods from the Americas, like I said, beaver pelts, but also, sugar. Sugar is a huge one, being grown largely in the Caribbean, but also in places like Brazil, the American South. Oh, and cotton, of course, right, being grown, again, Caribbean, Brazil, and the American South. So, wealth is growing, and what you get is you need more education to manage all that wealth. That merchant class gets bigger, more demand for education. Okay, so you kind of get 2 things going on, right? You need a longer period of schooling, which puts parents in the position of sort of being the ones managing their children's educations, right? Some of them do it by sending them to school, but there's still no public system of education, so it's expensive, or they do it by hiring tutors or directly teaching their children, right? So they enter a very direct role of being educators. Now, I do want to make one very side comment here, which Postman doesn't touch on as much, but I think is important. Here, Protestantism also plays a really important role, right? So Protestantism, hopefully you know what that is. If you don't, I'll explain it very quickly, right? On October 31st, Halloween of 1517, a guy named Martin Luther nails his list of 95 treaties, right? Basically arguments against how the Catholic Church is being run to the cathedral door in Wittenberg. And what happens is people pick that off the cathedral door And they're like, these are all things we agree with. And they take that over to the local printing press and get like thousands and hundreds of thousands of copies made of it, and it circulates all over Europe. And it launches this, what's called the Protestant Reformation, where Western Christianity essentially splits first in two, and then into a whole bunch of different pieces. One of those big branches, right, is obviously Catholicism. The other one is Protestantism, and there's a bunch of different kinds of Protestants. But one of the things that Protestantism stresses in particular is that every Christian, right, should read the Bible and interpret it for themselves. Okay, so starts in 1517. So one of the things, and this is so Martin Luther writes, the Lutheran Catechism, which is like a book of kind of official teachings. And in the Catechism, he says that it's the responsibility of parents to teach their children how to read, right? So one of the big roles of parents, particularly Protestant parents, is to educate their children so they can read the Bible, so they can make their own interpretations of, that particular sacred text. Okay, so not every country in Europe is Protestant, right? The Netherlands are, parts of France, though that ends up getting squished, parts of Germany, but very specifically England becomes a Protestant country. So England has particularly high literacy. Again, England is very rich. They make out like bandits in the kind of transatlantic trading system. They do really well. They're also relatively protected from continental wars because they're an island. They also have really nice wool, and everybody wants English wool. I can't remember the reason for this. Maybe English grass is just greener. Who knows? The grass is really greener in England. Now, what happens here, though, you get a huge growth of an English middle class, right? A merchant class principally. And they gather a lot of wealth, and they use that wealth to build bigger homes, right? So when you get into, later periods, if you've ever seen the show Downton Abbey, this is the kind of stuff that the wealthy merchant class in England gets, right? First they buy themselves titles of nobility, and then they use that to buy estates and bigger homes, right? I mean, Downton Abbey is probably bigger than most of them, but it starts with more rooms and more private space. And so what you start to get is a notion of the private and the public, right? And this will actually get deeper and deeper. And by the time you hit sort of Victorian England, right, in the 19th century, there are very, very clear codes of what's polite and what's impolite, and what you can talk about with whom, right? So children are to be, so obviously, when you have bigger rooms, suddenly children start to move into different spaces in the home. That's really important. I think I have this on another slide, and I'm getting ahead of myself. I am getting ahead of myself. I'll just say this here, right? So this idea that I talked about last time, where children and their parents slept in the same room, and you kind of know what your parents are doing at night, probably. That goes away because what happens is they build separate rooms for the children, right? And if you've ever seen the Disney movie, or any version of it, I suppose, Peter Pan, right? It starts with all the children in the nursery, right? And the big conflict of the film is Wendy is growing up, and her parents are like, it's time for you to move out of the nursery, and that's her entry into sort of adolescence and adulthood. Well, the nursery is the place you put your children so they don't see you, getting frisky at night, right? Or whatever adults do in their bedrooms. So you get that kind of distinction between private and public spaces, adult spaces and children's spaces. And if you ever, again, watched anything like, or you've read Pride and Prejudice or Downton Abbey, right? There's like the smoking room, right? Or the whiskey room, where the men go after dinner to talk amongst themselves about politics and economics, away from the far too delicate ears of children and women, right? So you get these very clear distinctions between private and public space. Okay, children for the middle class become the objects of conspicuous consumption, right? They start to buy more stuff for their kids because they have more money. So they buy books, they buy toys, they buy special clothing, right? They spend money on their children. Now, here's where, as we approach the Industrial Revolution, right, and this will be true through the entire industrial period, you have sort of differences, right? The middle class and upper classes can afford childhood, right? So the children of the middle class, get these kind of privileged lives where they have toys, they have tutors, they have education, maybe they go to school. For the lower classes, the working classes, the poor, they don't have that, right? They don't have the funds to give their children that kind of childhood. And it's going to take, a century or more for that to trickle down to the lower classes. And it's not even a particularly natural process, because what has to happen is the rich and middle class look around and they're like, wow, I love my children. They're so wonderful. Wait, that's a child too, except that child's poor and they're sweeping chimneys or living out on the street. Well, that's not okay. We should really, or working in mines, even worse than that, right? Working in mines. We really shouldn't allow that to happen. And then they start to pass things like child labor laws and truancy laws and force kids into school. But we'll talk about that next time, I'm sure. So it takes time and it's not a natural process. Okay, I haven't checked questions in a while. Popular? Recent? Okay, I don't know. I will hit reload and check one more time before the end. Okay, I think this is my last. Okay, that was the last question. Okay, I think this is my last. Oh, I have one more. We go all the way to 7. Okay, so what happens here, right? Well, adults control the symbolic environment of young people, right? They mete out information as they think kids are ready for it, right? And like I said, as you go forward towards the Victorian period, right, and Queen Victoria is the queen when Canada becomes a country in the middle part of the 19th century. As you move towards the Victorian period, that control over information gets tighter and tighter, right? There's more and more control over that symbolic environment. So that transition from child to adult, getting adult information about the world is very, very controlled, largely through, you build the mind of a good reader, and then, you release information to them about politics, about war, about sex, about all that fun stuff. Maybe we'll leave it with these last few points and then pick it up on Monday. So what Postman thinks, and again, he's coming from this perspective that technologies sort of imprint their biases on their users, right? What he calls media ecology. So he thinks that what print does to people is it basically brings out a few traits, right? So things like individuality, right? Because I say write a lot, I'm really sorry. As you read, right, you're in a kind of one-to-one conversation with that book. It's a sort of solitary activity, and so you as the individual relate to the thing that you're reading. Logical and sequential thinking, right, because language and writing is all about grammar and sequencing, and making arguments is about setting them up, he thinks that becomes the norm for people. Okay, this one, higher order abstraction. Reading allows us to talk about and imagine things that we can't actually see, right? Like, I will never go to Hogwarts because Hogwarts isn't actually a place unless it's in some theme park, right? But in reading like Harry Potter, I can imagine what Hogwarts is, right? And I can create an image of it in my mind without actually ever being there. And you can do that for almost anything, whether it's how to build a nuclear missile or, which not recommended, or, the existence of Harry Potter, or, what Anna Karenina's 19th century Russia is like, right? You create that in your mind. It's an abstraction that you get through putting those words together. And then delayed gratification, because if you're going to learn to read, you kind of have to sit there and be patient. To get to the end of a story, you have to read through the whole thing and go through those developments, unless you skip to the end of the book. But that's not fair. Don't do that. So it's important, right? And you learn to delay gratification, and that builds a sort of discipline. And here, this links up to things like Weber's notion of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Delayed gratification is important in capitalism because, you need to invest, you need to work hard for payouts that come later. And learning becomes an intellectual and moral pursuit. And when we get to some of the philosophers that Postman thinks are important, right, it's people like John Locke, not properly shaping a child's mind is shameful for the adults in their life, right? So it's important that we do a good job of shaping children's minds. Okay, I am out of time. We'll start on the last incunabula of childhood on Monday, and we'll keep going. And then we're going to get to the Industrial Revolution. Huzzah! Okay, and I'm going to fix Slido. I'm sorry about that. I wonder if I have it here.
Have a good weekend.
You as well. Oh. Ah.
My 11-year-old is struggling with reading.
Okay.
He's still behind.
Sure.
And then he read, just this year, he read all the Harry Potters. And we're like, you haven't seen the movies yet, so every time you read a book,
we can watch the movie.
Watch the movie. So it was like incentive. So then his teacher, he suggested that to the teacher.
Okay.
So now they're doing that in his grade 6 class.
Oh, that's so
for
fun.
Incentive. So you guys read this book, then we'll watch the movie.
I did the same thing with, he's now 13, with The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
He wanted to watch them because he heard they were cool, and I was like, great.
Read books first.
Here's the copy.
Right?
When you're done, we can watch the movie.
It's
And
good incentive, and now he's like ahead. So she said, she's like, if he continues the way that he's going right now and finishes grade 6 this way, she's wanting him to go into AP and junior high.
Oh, nice.
So I was like,
Sweet.
Have a good weekend.
You as well. Out of your way here.
Hey, we chat. Right?
Yes.
Hey, Enrico.
Hi. Oh, nice to meet
Nice to
you.
meet you. Hi.
What are you teaching?
We're gonna do 100 and
Okay. I just
you're not
finished.
doing 100.